I just wanted to mention that Carol J. Adams and I had edited a book called Ecofeminism. I'm adding the critical animal theory part to talk about today. This is the cover of the second edition of Ecofeminism, Feminist Intersections with Other Animals and the Earth. The second edition contains a whole new section of really, I think, important reading that we developed, and we also wrote a fairly lengthy 16,000 word essay at the beginning trying to situate ecofeminism in a variety of other, I would call critical theoretical traditions. But what I want to talk about today is a certain way of understanding ecofeminism and its connection to what Alice Query and I are calling critical animal theory. So that's part of what I will be discussing. So ecofeminism, as I understand it, is a political and intellectual movement that's grounded in the belief that there are conceptual, structural, and material links between the ongoing devastation of nature and the subjugation of women, other gender minorities, the poor, colonized, racialized, disabled, and other marginalized people, as well as non-human animals. The basic idea of ecofeminism, as I like to think about it, is that this exploitation and subordination can't be taken apart, so that we can't focus only on women or only on queer people or only on nature or only on animals, but that to adequately and effectively right the various wrongs impacting so many others, we must contest them together. They're structurally, by which I mean foundationally, linked. And when I say together, I don't mean at every moment, every part of that long list of people and others that are excluded become included, but that it be a part of our thinking all of the time. And I think this is a really important part of decolonizing feminist and ecofeminist work. So ecofeminism gives theoretical expression to the practice of activists in many parts of the world, women uniting with workers to protect children, to save trees, to protect other vulnerable people and animals, and to protest climate catastrophe. This is an article from March that I have on the screen. Making the connections between the exploitation of vulnerable, disrespected people and the more than human world helps to develop new ways of thinking about the state of global problems and paves the way for possible collaboration for resistance. One of the important insights of ecofeminism, I think, is that social, political, and economic mechanisms that are internal to racial capitalism explain the linked disdain for nature and the subjugation of women and members of racialized oppressed groups, as well as animals. So we can consider early writing by Carolyn Merchant, for example, to see how she argues that in early modern Europe and its colonies, the advent of capitalist modes of social organization went hand in hand with the use of animals and nature as resources, as well as the subordination of women, indigenous, and enslaved peoples. So capitalist expansion coincides with the tendency to exalt production, and I heard Krista saying this a little bit earlier, often wrongly representing it as cut off from biological and social reproduction work, usually associated with women and indigenous folks, and also people who have been enslaved. So that makes reproductive work, care work, and subsistence work put to the side, not attended to, not part of the social system that is thought to be quote unquote progressive and or productive. I'll say a little bit more about care a little bit later. But another strand of ecofeminist thought, which I think is really important, asks whether domestic labor and the environment should be thought of on the model of Marx's conception of primitive accumulation, and so as structurally resistant to incorporation into capitalist economies. So the idea of primitive accumulation highlights market society's dependence on these kind of prior assemblages of goods that aren't produced through market relations. So it's before the market. Think about enclosing the commons, for example. So Marx represents this kind of accumulation as an act of great violence, and says, I love this quote, and Alice and I quoted in Animal Crisis, that with reference to the enclosure and the forcible seizure of common land, and as well as enslavement and various forms of colonial conquest, quote, into the capital comes into the world dripping from head to toe, from every pore with blood and dirt. So there's this long-standing debate about whether primitive accumulation is a one-time phenomenon or required only to set this capitalist system into motion, or whether it's ongoing. And some ecofeminists maintain that the persistence of capitalism depends on the ongoing treatment of both nature and women's domestic labor as freely available resources. So this is the part of the ongoing accumulation. So capitalist societies rely on the ongoing expropriation from the earth, indigenous communities, and animals, as well as on mechanisms for forcibly obliging women to organize their reproductive lives and domestic labor in a manner that supports capitalism's continuation. The upshot is that women's social subjection and the destruction of nature can be seen as products of this particular interlocking social mechanism. And of course, there's other mechanisms, but I think it's really important to recognize the foundational role that capitalism plays. So ecofeminist claims about how capitalism devastates nature and expropriates women's labor without returning equal value has led some to the idea that we can internalize these values that are previously outside of capitalist economies. But there's, I think, and this is something that Alice and I talk also a little bit about in our book, that there's serious questions about the legitimacy of reducing this labor, as well as reducing the environment or somehow internalizing environmental problems to this instrumental or exchange values. And the reasons for skepticism about this, the legitimacy of this kind of reduction, are clear when we think about animals and animal lives and bodies. And this is why I think there's a very important connection between thinking about ecofeminism and thinking about animals. This is a really interesting way of seeing the reason that these things should be brought together. We can't properly pay off human debts for the costs, if you will, of the lives of other animals and thereby internalize them, because animals are the sorts of beings that are above price and shouldn't be thought of as exchangeable or disposable. Respecting animals requires abandoning the notion that they're mere resources and instead recognizing them as beings with dignity. Ecofeminists bring into question the models of progress and growth that are central to the functioning of racial capitalist societies and urge that we see dignity-filled values of both human and non-human life that are often obscured by the capitalist logics of exchange. As the late ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood describes in an essay entitled Decolonizing Relations with Nature that she published over 20 years ago, that should be noted. People are talking about decolonizing ecofeminism, and Val Plumwood was trying to do that 20 years ago as well. The sphere of nature has in the past been taken to include what are thought of as less ideal and more primitive forms of the human. And this includes women and supposedly quote unquote primitive people who are seen as exemplifying an earlier and more, if you will, animal stage of human development. So whether human or non-human, categorizing some as nature, like putting some people or animals in the context of this idea of nature, that upholds a specific conceptual ideology of European colonialism. And this conceptual ideology is one that naturalizes the value dualisms that ecofeminists are critical of, but that are often not assessed as products of colonization. So in a sense, our minds have been colonized by these dualisms that both justify and reproduce capital and patriarchy. But part of the decolonizing work that ecofeminists are doing, I think, is imagining new relational grounds for ethical and political engagement. So what are these relational grounds that help us to restructure our relationships with animals, the rest of nature, and each other? Before we talk about these relations, which I'll do towards the end, we need to look, I think, at the conceptual and ideological work that dualisms or hierarchies perform in obscuring and undermining flourishing relationships. So ecofeminists have argued that we must expose and combat value dualisms that have structured Western thoughts and institutions. So Val Plumwood writes, for example, that dualism makes difference the vehicle for hierarchy. It usually does so by distorting difference. She explains that a dualism results from a certain kind of denied dependence on a subordinated other. So there's this relationship of denied dependency that determines a certain kind of social structure in which the denial of the relation of the dominant and subordinate shape the identity of both the dominant and the subordinate. And analyzing these mutually reinforcing logics of domination and drawing connections between the practical implications of power relations has long been, I think, a core project of ecofeminism. Now, I know that we talked a little bit earlier today, or I caught the very edge of Chris's talk, but these dualisms are, as we say, culture, nature, male, female, mind, body, master, slave, reason, emotion, human, non-human. And the purpose of, and there's many more, but the purpose of these dyads is not only to demarcate and perpetuate differences, but to mark those with power and those available to be exploited by those with power. That's what these binaries or these dualisms are doing. They also, importantly, constrain our thinking about other ways to understand our relationships with each other and other animals and the rest of nature. And as Yanestra King, early ecofeminist, wrote back in 1983, think of that, really long time ago, 40 years, right? The dialectical relationship between the subjugation of women and the subjugation of nature is supported by these hierarchical dualisms that have to be resisted at all levels. So this has been a long-standing commitment of ecofeminists to try to sort of show the way these dualisms uphold these structures and systems that are causing so much harm to nature, animals, and marginalized human beings. These value dualisms empower one side and dominate the other, and they're necessary for oppression. So, for instance, there's this example that I think is really important to think about a lot, is that when we have this division between man and woman, for example, and it's central in early parts of ecofeminist thinking too, what is happening is that gender binary is being reinscribed, right? And so then the possibility of gender fluidity or non-binary or a-binary kind of gender expression is not just made invisible, but it's also made impossible. So it sort of creates a fiction that it's either or, and it fails to notice that there are other than human beings, for example, that don't even constitute their gender in these human binary ways. So there's all sorts of problems with these dualisms, and that's just one example. But another really important problem that I just wanted to highlight has to do with these hierarchies, and this is an old hierarchy, and of course it's the pedigree of man, but if you look at this hierarchy, I'll say a little bit about this. This is really troubling ways of thinking about categories that are created and then valued in differential ways. So these hierarchies rank beings in virtue of the qualities or capacities they might share with those at the top, man. And here, of course, it's not man, it's white man. And it's not just white man, it's rich white man. And recent work exploring parallels between animalization and dehumanization and racism further illustrate the ways that hierarchies are particularly troubling. So, and there's a lot of really important work that's being done that I'm sure you're aware of, but just in virtue of wanting to highlight further reading, there's a really important book by Josh Bennett called on being property once myself. There's a fantastic book by Bénédicte Boisseron, Zakiya Jackson, Af and Sil Ko, David Livingston Smith, that are all dealing with these issues of the concept of the human, the concept of the not yet human, the concept of the non-human, and the role that hierarchies play in dehumanization, both historically and up to the time being. These hierarchical ways of thinking are central to liberal humanist scholarship, as well as it turns out, mainstream discussions of animal ethics. Hierarchical ideology appears expansive. The men on top want to include people in other races and political communities because they share qualities that those at the top find important. And they want to include in the animal ethics realm animals in our moral consideration because, like humans, they're sentient and experience pains and pleasures. But these hierarchical ways of thinking often get taken up by those who mean well, but are nonetheless end up erasing other ways of living. And so they're always going to be fundamentally anthropocentric. So ecofeminists reject such hierarchies that causally explain the linked disdain for nature and the subjugation of women and members of overlapping racialized exploited groups. And ecofeminists have been responding to environmental destruction and interconnected oppressions by calling for a restructuring of our relationships with nature, animals, and fellow humans. And as Alice and I adopt in the new book, Animal Crisis, this idea of critical animal theory is what we're calling, or what we're naming, the shift in perspective. Critical animal theory provides a radically different way of thinking about and talking about our relationships with other animals than this liberal humanist and more traditional animal ethics model that I just mentioned. One of the differences is that critical animal theorists argue that the division between humans and animals is not natural, but a conceptual division that privileges humans over animals, and it's not all humans at that, as I've been saying. So this divide operates in a way that justifies the oppression of animals and those that are thought to be closer to animals. This is the important move. So that means often this link, when people think about ecofeminism saying women are closer to nature, that's one very simple way of putting this, but the idea is that the ruling class, if you will, the ruling ideology tries to make these divisions so that you can justify the oppression of one over the other, because nature and animals are already lower in these hierarchies. And so critical animal theory challenges these hierarchical structures that hurt animals and hurt humans too. And respecting animals ultimately requires abandoning the notion that they are mere vessels for suffering or loci for interests. And ecofeminists have argued against the ways that what we could call maybe the logic of fungibility that's central to capitalism and central to the devaluation of so many for the profit of a few, requires that maybe all, right, life can be reduced to use value and destroyed. And so I want to just give an example. I think I'm okay for time. I just want to give an example of a really clear case. It's one that I often talk about, and I apologize in advance. One of the slides is kind of gross. So this is Marius the giraffe, the 2-year-old giraffe that was shot in the head by administrators of the Copenhagen Zoo back in 2014. And okay, my apologies, here's a trigger warning. They cut up Marius in front of a group of watching children and parents at the zoo, and then ended up feeding Marius's body to these lions. I think it's really important to think about what the education of they suggested that this was a public display for educational purposes, and that really raises, I think, an important question, like what is it that is people are being educated about? And I would suggest that this is a clear education and reinforcement of this kind of logic of fungibility, or the notion of the natural, quote unquote, disposability of beings like Marius. I should add here, and I often do, that those lions were also killed by the Copenhagen Zoo not long after they fed Marius's body to them, because they wanted to make room for more quote unquote genetically worthy captives. There's a whole bunch of work I'm doing right now on zoos' justification for killing. But this particular justification for killing Marius was a fairly typical justification. It's all about genetic purity. So sacrificing the lives of animals in the name of conserving a diverse gene pool is really commonplace in zoos. It's particularly commonplace in European zoos. And the animals, therefore, I believe, are seen as specimens. They're not seen as dignified beings. They're seen as specimens, but they're not commodities in the way that many things that are traded on the market are commodities. They are traded in other ways. They're traded based on their genetics, and then they're forced to reproduce. But as really important Black intellectual thinker Saidiya Hartman notes about slaves, they're captured, owned, and traded for another. And they're therefore they're seen as property, but a very specific kind of property, a specimen, right? Or some sort of, not quite a toaster, not like a toaster or a shovel or a tractor or what have you, but as a specimen. And this specimenification, sorry for that ugly word, creates and continues to reinforce, I think, the afterlives in the zoo community of scientific racism, eugenic ideologies, and the exploitation of anything that's deemed other, put it in the specimen category. So zoo captives, I think, are disposable specimens par excellence, right? Perhaps they're interesting, perhaps they're beautiful, perhaps they're entertaining, but they're always fundamentally disposable. And so we need to turn from that kind of particular logic of thinking about other animals and the role that they play as disposable specimens within this market system to a system that moves away from those distorted relationships and towards more care-centered relations. I just put this slide up. This is Vine Sanctuary, multi-species community that I'll mention briefly at the end, but I didn't want to leave the slide of Marius getting eaten by lions that were soon to die on the screen. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about care and then turn finally to relationality. So care can be a radical act of love and resistance. And care-centered strategies of resistance can be pursued both within personal relationships and within the broader political sphere. We can create caring communities based on mutual aid, communal space, shared resources, and localized decision-making and shared desire for mutual thriving. So I just want to give an example of a particularly poignant and important bunch of work being done in the US, in Baltimore, by Brenda Sanders and the Afro-Vegan Society, as well as others in Black neighborhoods in New York and Atlanta and other cities that work to introduce healthy plant-based foods to the community, the largely economically disadvantaged and racially marginalized communities. So for many people in low-income neighborhoods, in the United States anyway, they don't have access to fresh, healthy food. One study in New York City found that bodegas outnumbered grocery stores 18-1. And one of the poorest neighborhoods in Brooklyn, New York, had 57 bodegas for any one grocery store. And you can't really get good, healthy produce at bodegas, usually. The lack of healthy food, which is often framed as either being in a food desert or food apartheid, has deep ramifications in communities of color, making people vulnerable to premature death. Fortunately, there are people and organizations that are fighting that, like Brenda and the Afro-Vegan Society. And as the Afro-Vegan Society website notes, many people, quote, have come to view veganism as both a viable solution to some of the challenges that currently face our communities, as well as, and this is really important, a vehicle for resisting the systems that are responsible for creating these kinds of threats. So Animals, so one way of thinking about how care can work to sort of undo the disposability and marginalization of certain communities is that kind of community work. The other way that care can work is between animals. And one of the things that I think is really important is the two at the top here are images from Vine Sanctuary, and the chimpanzees are at Chimphaven, a sanctuary in Louisiana, Vine Sanctuaries in Vermont and New York. And what you see here is, on the first instance, this little cow, I don't know if this will show, but I don't know if you can see this, but this little cow, this is baby Maddox, and this is Alfie, a sheep, who's welcoming him to the sanctuary. He was just a little guy. This photo later is him grown up here when his mother got rescued. That was Moxie, and you could see that they recognize each other even though it was many years later. The image of the chimpanzees here, this is the late Sarah chimpanzee, who was helping Henry and providing and extending care to Henry. Henry was a chimpanzee who was privately owned, kept in a garage and fed Twinkies. He was close to death when the Houston SPCA got him. He had no idea how to be a chimpanzee, and Sarah was one of the chimps that tried to help. So animals in these caring communities can be active members who themselves aid the collective, and providing caring multi-species communities for formerly farmed animals at sanctuaries, for example, I think is one of the clear models of radical community care. These sanctuaries not only provide meaningful, safe spaces for the non-human residents in their care, but also help us to reframe and reimagine our relationships with animals that have traditionally been characterized by power and control. So in reimagining our relations with animal others who are now starting to be considered in larger social justice work, we open our minds to the expansive textures of exploitation, and in so doing can deepen our moral perception of the damages of these social structures that I've been talking about. So in addition to being sites of empathetic interactions with others, sanctuaries are, in, as Elon Abrel notes in his recent award-winning book on sanctuary, quote, models of alternative modes of interspecies engagement, countersites to the political economic arenas of use. And that provides a clear vision of what it might look like to live ethically with others outside of the commodity structure that I began with. So this can lead to, I think, really important transformative social change. Creating community and caring for those in the community can also be conceived as a revolutionary form of self-care. Audre Lorde describes self-care as a kind of warfare, since finding ways to exist in a world that wants to destroy or diminish you and your community is a radical act. And caring relationally can help us move closer, I would argue, to social justice. So let me just add and try to end with a little bit about the way in which relationality is so important and why it's so important for social justice. So we're in already all kinds of relationships. I make the case for this in my book, Entangled Empathy. These relationships aren't just random connections between sui generis individuals that come together like billiard balls, but they're actually what constitutes us, who we are, how we are. And in this sense, we're not just there interacting, but to use Karen Barad's notion, we're intra-acting, we're creating ourselves in our relationships. And a recognition of the relationships will, I believe, motivate reflection on how well those relationships are going, what kind of relationships we actually are in. And that will move us, I hope, to attend to the relationships to make them better. So my thought here is that nobody really wants to be in a bad relationship. And so the idea then is, if we recognize that we're in bad relationships, instrumentalized relationships, objectifying relationships, relationships that lead to harm, that we're going to want to do better to make more sustainable relationships. And being able to change our relationships ultimately requires more than just the personal, right? It's a political act. Social resources are needed to support reflection and community engagement. And that can lead to structural, I hope, can lead to structural change. So part of what I want to end by saying is that ecofeminism may very well be what Alice and I say in Animal Crisis. There's a picture of this, the critical theory of our time. And it can help us see these connections, help us to forge solidarity, and build new forms of political consciousness that can help us attune to the distortions of power that harm vulnerable people, non-human animals, both domestic animals as well as wild animals I didn't really talk about, and the very planet that is our only home. So we are at a political and ecological crisis point, and we need to radically rethink our relationships with each other and the more than human world, and to act boldly to change course. I think ecofeminism can help us to analyze the various problems we confront, but not only that, it can guide us in changing course, hopefully before it's too late. So I will end there.